I'm standing right at the very spot that Calvary Church was birthed. In 1928, a guy by the name of Pastor Watson, he had ended up being in jail and being put in prison in Montana for serving a sentence of robbery. But in that sentence, he found Jesus, and Jesus became the center focus of his life. And he wanted to tell everyone he knew about that. So when he got out of prison in 1928, he came to this very spot, to Central Public School, and in the summer he set up a massive tent. And for 2 months in the summer, he held these awesome tent meetings where he stood and he talked about how Jesus had transformed and changed his life. This had a massive impact on the community, and hundreds of people were coming out. I read a newspaper article that defined the meetings as large crowds full of joyful people singing worship to Jesus. Now, I think it's so cool to think that our church was birthed with two key factors. That it was birthed with, one, the idea that we have to tell others about who God is and we have to impact our community. And two, it was birthed with powerful moments of worship, of people singing and worshiping praise to Jesus, their Lord and their Creator. It was awesome. Well, out of those tent meetings came a few families that found Jesus and felt they were called by God to plant a church here in Woodstock. And they wanted to dream. Their dream when they planted a church here out of these tent meetings was that they would actually impact the city for God, and that people would be healed, forgiven of their sins, and set free. And so they started looking for places, and for many years, from 1928 to 1934, they just rented several places throughout the city because it didn't matter where they met, it just mattered that they met. And they got together and they worshiped God and they prayed for the city. In 1934, in partnership with the Western Ontario District Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, they had a big, huge revival meeting at the fairgrounds right here in town. And at that revival meeting, several more families came to know Jesus, and several more families joined this church. And they planted a permanent facility right here at Hatch Street and Wellington, right here in Woodstock. They named this permanent facility Grace Tabernacle. And out of that, our church was birthed. It's so exciting to think that in this spot, God birthed something for our city where the focus was worship, His presence, and reaching those who are far from God. From 1934 to 1937, they were meeting in this Hatch Street and Wellington place, and God was using them in powerful ways. In fact, in this little house, they were running church services and they were experiencing God's presence in powerful ways. God was showing up on Sunday mornings, and then they'd come back for Sunday night church and have prayer meetings. And these prayer meetings would last way into the night of them worshiping, singing, and praying and seeking God's presence. In fact, those prayer meetings became so long and so loud that the neighbors who lived in the houses right next door to the church complained to the police, and the police actually had to show up a couple of times and shut down the church services. This even led to the point that the church and the pastor, who was Reverend E.N. Colbuck, he was charged with public nuisance because the services went too late into the night and were too loud. How cool is it to think that the birthing of this church was centered around experiencing God's power, that people took notice of it, even in the law. It was amazing that it took national news and took the city council because they were so consumed with how loud and how much this church loved Jesus. Well, obviously the church grew underneath that leadership, and that little house on Wellington and Hatch Street became too small to house that congregation. And so they started looking for property. And on Sunday, May 4th, 1941, they were able to purchase a place on 24 Light Street. And it was a church that used to be called the Congregational Church. And they moved into this building, they renovated the building, and they held their very first service on Sunday, May 4th, 1941. And they changed their name from Grace Tabernacle to Calvary Community Church. And they wanted to impact the community. And so they started Sunday schools, and their Sunday schools were so powerful and so awesome. They actually were sending out buses into the community to pick up kids and bring them to church on Sunday morning. They had youth ministries that were running where they had youth executives and youth teams that would gather together on Sundays and different days of the week and learn to pray and read and do stuff. They did creative dramas in order to engage the community and bring the community here and to talk to people and let people know about Jesus. It was an amazing time. And under several different pastors, the church grew, had more community impact, and they changed their name from Calvary Community Church to Calvary Pentecostal Church, Woodstock. In 1998, Pastor Keith Bishop came to Calvary. And he came into the 24 Light Street and he had a heartbeat to see the church grow and impact his community. He desired that this church would have a regional impact to impact everybody inside our city with the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so he focused heavily on worship. They created orchestra pits and had full orchestra for worship. They were community focused. They sat and did so many amazing things in the community. One of the most famous things that we were known for during this time was our Christmas dinners. They hosted these Christmas dinners here in Woodstock where they would see almost 1,000 people come and enjoy a free meal and enjoy all kinds of fun activities and win some great prizes, but also hear the story of Jesus. Well, underneath Pastor Keith's leadership, the church was growing. Lives were being impacted. They were making a difference inside our city. And they knew they needed to step out and build because the building they were in was becoming old, it was becoming unsafe, and it definitely wasn't able to handle the crowd that was growing. So they had a dream to move from 24 Light Street to the property we're on right now, 65 Lansdowne. And they started a building fund where they had to raise $1.8 million. And they stepped out in faith and started building the building we have now. And in 2003, they came to this property and opened up Calvary Church. It's been an amazing journey. Underneath his leadership, the church started into this building. It continued to grow, continued to have influence, continued to read so many articles about the dramas that we used to do and the youth engagement things we used to do. And then with a heartbeat to serve our city, they still owned 24 Light Street and they were trying to figure out what should we do with it. And they made the radical decision that instead of selling the building for a couple $100,000, they chose to give the building away to an outreach organization called Youth for Christ right here in Woodstock. And they wanted to give that building as a gift to another ministry to say, go and reach this city. See, our church has been birthed and always been focusing on the reality of three things. Our church desires to be always on the move, always going forward, always doing what we can to create space for more to come. Our church has always been built around the idea of reaching those who are far from God, those who aren't plugged into our community, into our church, but those who are in our community who need to know the life-changing power of Jesus. And our church has been centered around the idea of God being worshiped and being experienced in his fullness.